Where are you going? Quinn asked the Sentinel, who was clearly getting ready to leave. Andrometron. We're gonna need all the help we can get going against Conchna. I know the Andromedan elite have something against him, so I figure I may as well check it out. You think it's gonna be dangerous? Quinn asked, her hand hovering over her rifle, which was leaning against the wall. Better safe than sorry. The Sentinel shrugged. Quinn picked up the rifle and split it into two pistols. She held out her hand. The Sentinel let down the face of his false palm on her shoulder, and they were off in a flash. They appeared on the surface of Andrometron. Ilsos shone brightly on the horizon, acting as the planet's stand-in for a sunset. They stood in the middle of a wide-open field, waiting. Quinn didn't know exactly what they were waiting for, but she trusted that the Sentinel knew what he was doing. The ground shook, and soon a single massive skyscraper lifted from the riverbeds ahead of them. Quinn jumped back in surprise, but tried to play it off when she noticed the Sentinel standing unaffected. When the massive tower simply seemed to snap into place, the doors slid open. Hundreds of Andromedan soldiers, all wearing their signature black suits and red ties, ran to the Sentinel, all armed with rifles pointed up. They were yelling for them to put their hands up. Quinn reached for her pistols. Wait. The Sentinel held out his hand in front of Quinn. We're trying to get them on our side. He held his hands up compliantly. Quinn scowled, confused, but lifted her hands too after clipping her pistols back on. The Andromedan guards led the Sentinel and Quinn into the skyscraper, and just as the last guard made his way in, the door shut. The building began to lower back into the ground. The Sentinel and Quinn stood by, swaying idly, staring blankly ahead as the tower lowered deeper into the ground like a massive elevator. The guards continued pointing their guns to the Sentinel's face. The trip down took longer than expected. Could use some elevator music? Quinn commented. The Sentinel tilted his head slightly with a subtle nod, agreeing. It seemed as if the room they stood in started to rotate and click into place, upside down relative to its starting position, though the Sentinel and Quinn still felt as if they were facing up. When the tower stopped, the Andromedans pushed the Sentinel and Quinn out of the tower and into the secret underground world of Andrometron. Quinn couldn't help but stare. The sprawling cityscape extended even past the horizon, curving up the concave interior of the planet. Andrometron, apparently, was hollow. The Sentinel looked up, admiring the dense forest of buildings seemingly hanging from the ceiling above. In the center of the whole planet sat its core, connected to the surface by extending roots of glowing rock. The core itself seemed to act as a sort of miniature sun, producing enough light to illuminate the whole inside of the planet in eternal sunset. Skyscrapers flew up to the outside of the planet. The riverbeds from underneath looked to be roads of some sort, sprawling across the ceiling, walls, and floors of the planet like veins. The Sentinel followed a skyscraper with his eyes as it shot across the sky and out of the planet. He was interrupted by a guard pushing him to walk faster. I'm going, the Sentinel assured him. It had been so long since he had been in awe of something before. Sentinel, this is crazy, Quinn said in a loud whisper. And I thought Ilsos was cool. No wonder they're jealous. These dudes sure are the elite, huh? Yeah. The Sentinel kept staring. Hey, where are you taking us? The Sentinel asked the nearest Andromedan guard, pushing at him. The Council, she answered. They approached what looked like a miniaturized city covered in a light blue dome. At the center of the small domed city looked to be a massive fire pit. As they entered the dome, the soldiers redirected them into a pristine white and chrome building. The building looked ancient. It was missing a few panels. Inside, they were met with a round, floating glass table. Around the table sat 6 men wearing Andromedan suit and tie uniforms. Each of their suits were differently colored, ranging from the purest white to the darkest black. Hey, the Sentinel greeted the Andromedans with a smile and a little nod. You can put the guns down, I'm not here to fight. That's new. The Andromedan furthest to the right commented. His suit was the brightest white. Seems wherever you are, destruction follows. Yeah, well. The Sentinel's smile faded. Just a coincidence. DeMarcus, head of Andrometron. The man introduced himself. These are my fellow leaders of the Ilsos district. Aaron, head of Dial, Naz, head of Basid, Jaren, head of Loron, Kornith, head of Sanzi, Miser, former head of Galactic Jail, and Nelso, head of Ilsos. He introduced the men in order of lightest to darkest suits. What do you want? Were you all around for the last war? The Sentinel asked. Clearly you don't remember us then, DeMarcus chuckled. Of course we were. I'm the guy who cloned you. The Sentinel's fist instantly tightened. What? Oh, shit. Quinn whispered. Why? Why specify the last war? What's going on? DeMarcus asked. The Sentinel tried to keep his cool. You guys seem a lot more peaceful than last time. The Sentinel had trouble saying it. War changes people, Sentinel. Miser, the former head of a Galactic Jail, spoke up. Shut up, Miser, DeMarcus snapped. He turned his attention back to the Sentinel. Like I said, what do you want? Information, is all. The Sentinel's fingers sparked ever so slightly. The guards behind him lifted their weapons again. Quinn kept her hands over her guns just to be safe. There's another war coming. Is that a threat? DeMarcus asked. With Ilsos. They seem to be working quite independently from Andrometron as of late, wouldn't you say? The Sentinel cracked his knuckles and revved the gears in his metallic fingers. I'd say they have always sort of been working independently, but I do think I understand where you're coming from, what with Project Ray and all. Nelso, head of Ilsos, commented. Is King Vistor an actual figurehead that you acknowledge? The Sentinel asked. There hasn't been an Andromedan government-recognized king for decades, not since the legitimate Ilsian heir to the throne was murdered. Velant's position was stolen while his cousin next in line, Ciriv, was jailed trying to fight for it. Nelso assured the Sentinel. Vistor's reign started off brutal and has delved into incompetence, as one would expect from Ilsos in the hands of Lurinians. Vistor seems to be nothing more than a puppet. I'm sure you're familiar with Conchna. The Sentinel stared DeMarcus down. Of course. He created enough of a threat that has been picked up on the emissaries of the Extraverse's radar. That's a problem. I was wondering if you would maybe be willing to help us take them down and establish proper rule. The Sentinel suggested. We could put this Ciriv guy back in charge. No, Miser interjected with a waver in his voice. That guy's insane. Leftness would be the ideal pick, Aaron suggested. What say do you have in our politics anyway? Nelso asked the Sentinel, sounding offended. Before the Sentinel could think of a response, the ground shook. At first, he and Quinn shook it off as a tower getting ready to rise, but the surprise on the Council's faces told a different story. What's happening? The Sentinel asked. The ground shook again. Don't think we're blind. We know you're behind this. DeMarcus stood up, threateningly pointing at the Sentinel. I swear I'm not, the Sentinel protested. Sir, I don't think he is. Miser tried to speak up. He was the shortest of the six. His hair was a fiery red, curly and short, his skin just as pale as what would be expected from Andromedans. DeMarcus backhanded Miser in the face, leaving a noticeable mark on his cheek. Hey! Quinn stepped forward. The guards all lifted their guns, the sounds of charging blasts echoed behind the Sentinel. Before anyone could react, the ground behind them exploded in a huge burst of energy. The ground cracked and the sky shone through. Guards fell over, some fell onto the surface, through the fires of the explosion that cracked the planet's crust. The Sentinel jumped with Quinn onto the table to stay clear of the blast. They slid across the table, and as they hit the floor, the Sentinel slammed his palm onto the ground. The box disconnected, staying on the floor as the dome shield emanated from it. The shield closed in around the Sentinel, Quinn, and Miser, who just squeezed in. Soon the smoke and dust settled, and the tunnel through the planet's thin crust became clearer. A spaceship locked itself into the entrance, covering it up. A hatch opened and stayed open for a short while. Hold your fire, DeMarcus yelled. The guards that remained alive stood on one knee, guns pointed at the hatch. They all waited in anticipation before a few clicking sounds and a puff of smoke distracted them all. From the hatch shot a small object. It whistled through the sky, aimed directly at the planet's core. You've got to be kidding me. The Sentinel stared as the torpedo-shaped object flew past the core, headed straight for the city above. When the object hit, it burst into a fiery explosion, and a blinding light filled the planet, the explosion deafening. Oh shit! Quinn yelled, dropping down onto the ground. Why? Miser screamed. The city above burst into flames and fell in seconds. Presumably millions of Andromedans had been slaughtered. Fire! DeMarcus yelled, pointing at the spaceship in the tunnel. The guards opened fire and bombarded the hole in the crust with relentless laser fire. It wasn't long before they realized they'd been shooting at a force field. They stared at the hatch after ceasing fire, wondering what it and they would do next. A small puff of smoke burst from the hatch, and another torpedo launched, but only a few feet in the air. Drop! The Sentinel yelled. DeMarcus jumped into the shield, as did Nelso and Nas. A few guards jumped for it, but it was too late. The Sentinel lifted his arms and quickly created a shield of plasma around the already deployed shield of the box. Then he braced. The torpedo hit the ground, and boom. The Sentinel could have sworn the screams were louder than the blast. After a few seconds of torturous bombardment, he opened his eyes. He could hear nothing but a high-pitched ringing in his ears. Miser hugged the ground and kept his body as low as possible. Quinn sat huddled near the Sentinel. The three of them couldn't see anything through the bright light and the heavy dust, especially while looking through the layers of shielding. The Sentinel could notice, however, that the plasma shield was in poor condition. The lime green shield of the box was cracked somehow. A few moments later, the Sentinel felt that maybe the explosion had settled enough for it to be safe for him to venture outside of the safety bubble of the shields. As he began to sit up, Quinn took notice. What are you, insane? She reached out for the Sentinel's false arm. You'll burn out there. The Sentinel looked back at Quinn. His entire body burst in plasmatic flames. The instant spark of purple startled Quinn, and Miser flinched on the floor. I'm used to it. The shield dropped just long enough for the Sentinel to step out. When his foot stepped onto the floor, he expected to hit smooth ground. Instead, his leg was stopped abruptly before it lowered past his back foot, standing on a large pile of rubble. He pushed himself up and stood on the piece of wall. He pushed away the ash and smoke with a burst wave of plasma, which gave him unclouded vision of his immediate surroundings. The pristine white tower they were once in was no more. The city was obliterated. The Sentinel looked around at the rest of Andrometron, determined to keep it from the same fate. When the dust fully settled, the shield lowered. The only remnant of the polished tile floor was the circle left underneath the guards Quinn, DeMarcus, Nelso, Nas, and Miser that the shield had protected. They stood slowly and cautiously. Sentinel, what the hell are you pulling? DeMarcus yelled. Still gonna blame me, huh? The Sentinel turned around. I saved you.
Nice change of pace.
A shrill voice called out behind the Sentinel. The Sentinel turned around slowly to face the hatch of the ship that launched the bombs. From the ship stepped Conchna, followed by Ray, and then Agro. The three clones approached the Sentinel slowly. Ray's blue suit stood out in the dark rays and blacks of the destruction, and his coattails billowed behind him like waves. Sentinel, why are they here? Quinn asked, her voice trembling. The Sentinel stayed silent, waiting for one of the clones to speak up. We weren't expecting to see survivors of the blast, but when we did, we knew it had to be you. Concha spoke up. The Sentinel, always getting into trouble, Agro added. Ray stood idly by, tossing his remote and catching it, not saying a word. His screen was hard to see in the harsh beaming light of the sky of Andrometron below. The Sentinel could tell that his beady yellow eyes were indeed staring at him. Miser spoke up. Why are you doing this? The war was over, I don't understand. He stumbled back, not being able to keep up his confident front. Concha laughed, and shortly after, Agro joined in. Ray stayed silent. Miser? Is that you? Concha continued laughing. He turned his attention back to the Sentinel. You saved that guy? Concha pretended to wipe away a tear and stopped his laughing with a drawn-out breath. Whew, yeah, that's funny. He put his hands on his waist and puffed his chest outward, then fell back into a straight standing position. Well, now that we have you here, I think it's time we did some bargaining. So, Calcarus. Why? Why do you need it? The Sentinel asked. Calcarus? Calcarus B? Is that what this is about? Miser spoke up. This is about a lot of things you wouldn't understand. Concha responded to Miser. I was right to banish you, DeMarcus yelled from the floor. You're crazy. He got up and left the dome shield, raising a pistol. Shut it, DeMarcus! Concha yelled. He flung out his scythe, extending the blade. As he did, a blast of plasma shot from the tip and hit DeMarcus in the head, consuming it in a bright flame, burning it to a crisp and killing him as he fell to the ground. Miser stepped back in fear. The other Andromedans ran from the dome in fear, trying to escape. Quinn screamed. Concha lifted his scythe and blasted the Andromedans trying to run, killing them. Miser, Quinn, and the Sentinel were the only ones left. So, I take it you aren't up for bargaining? Concha asked. That's not what I do. The Sentinel's fist flared with plasma burning brighter than Quinn had ever seen it before. Good. Concha turned his attention to Ray. Let me have this one. Concha shook his shoulders and loosened his suit jacket, sliding it off his arms and dropping it to the floor. The tip of his scythe glowed passively. He held out his arms. His veins seemed to be glowing a deep purple. I may not have plasma powers, but I have been strengthened. The Sentinel held up his arms and clenched his fists. All right. He spit. He ran forward and flung forward with his false arm, hitting Concha in the face. Concha's head swung back and he stumbled. He shook his head and spun the scythe. He jumped, flipping over the Sentinel while swinging the scythe over his head. The Sentinel, with the box already implanted in his palm, quickly flashed away, dodging the slice. As Concha landed on the ground, the Sentinel appeared behind him, kicking him in the back and slamming him into the ground. The Sentinel kicked the scythe away and picked up Concha by the collar, punching him in the face. Concha swung his foot underneath the Sentinel's legs, knocking him off balance. The Sentinel quickly jumped up off the floor. He reached forward to grab Concha's shoulders. Concha pushed both arms away and kicked the Sentinel in the chest. He held out his hand, and with a magnetic plating in his palm, remotely called the scythe back to his hand. He spun it and flung it forward. The Sentinel held up his prosthetic arm to block it. He pushed back, then teleported behind Concha. Concha expected it the second time around, jabbing the end of the staff into the Sentinel's chest. Concha ducked down and spun, slicing and clipping the Sentinel's ankle, drawing blood. The Sentinel fell, screaming. He put out his hands and a pillar of plasma shot out from them. Without hesitation, Ray lifted his hand. Swiftly, like a hot knife through butter, Ray split the plasma down the middle with his remote. The plasma missed Concha entirely. The Sentinel scooched back, surprised. Concha looked at Ray. What is this? He asked.
Enough play, let's get this over with.
Ray growled. Again, the Sentinel blasted plasma from his hands, even stronger. Ray, Concha, and Agro were consumed in the flames. When the flames vanished, the three of them were gone. Sentinel! Quinn yelled. The Sentinel turned around. The three of them stood behind him, between him and the people he'd saved.
Remind you of anything, Sentinel?
Ray teased. He pointed his remote at him. No, don't do this again! Ah! The Sentinel rose his arms to his head. When the darkness had settled, the Sentinel looked around. He was in some sort of temple, and in front of him stood three faces he didn't think he'd see again. Himself, Matrona, and Kogar. He looked down at his hands, bird-like and scrawny. Billowing flames burst from his mouth, and the flames overtook the three. He shook his head. No! He screamed. I'm not like him, no!
Give in. You know you are.
Ray's voice echoed.
You're just like him.
Again, darkness flooded his vision. Rogar's menacing voice grumbled softly.
Give me the girl.
The looming presence of the orphanage filled the Sentinel's vision. Adam Jaminski stood next to a young Matrona, confronting the matron at the desk. Give me the girl.
You were always like him. A monster.
Ray's sharp voice stabbed at the Sentinel's ears with his chuckling.
And now you're working with the Andromedans?
The image of Matrona faded away and the darkness returned.
Tisk, tisk, tisk.
Ray whispered.
You've been a bad boy.
I did too. A voice echoed.
You killed her, you know that?
Stop it. The Sentinel spoke back.
You let her die for you.
Ray hissed. Amara's screams rattled through the Sentinel's mind.
You're worse than him. The only being you ever knew that he actually killed was Kogar, And you're never feeling guilty about your old friend's death, are you? Because you didn't do it.
Shut up! The Sentinel yelled. He could see himself in the darkness, except it wasn't him, it was his past self. The Paradox Master sat alone in the dark on a throne of rubble. The Sentinel approached him. When he looked up, his face was a screen, and Ray's yellow grin stretched wide.
If you really want to save the multiverse, then do it. Remove yourself from it.
Ray's screen shut off, and everything around the Sentinel twirled into nothingness until his vision was restored. He breathed quickly, gasping for air and holding his throat. He fell forward and caught himself with his false arm. He looked up at Ray, pleading with his eyes. Please. Sentinel, what's happening? Fight back! Quinn yelled from the shield.
Yeah, Adam. What's wrong?
Ray smiled. Why are you doing this? The Sentinel coughed. For fun?
One could say that, yeah.
Ray tapped his foot on the ground impatiently. Aggro looked at him with a slight worry in his eyes. Conchna stood by him uneasily. Who's the man behind the screen? Who is he really? The Sentinel started to stand. Show me.
Look at you, standing up to fight again. What does it take to break you?
Ray seemed angry. He stomped his foot down. His screen flickered and his yellow animated face grew sharper and red. The Sentinel shot out his arm, and spikes of crystal plasma burst from the rubble behind Ray so quickly that he didn't have time to react. The spikes broke through the back of his screen and chest and shot out of the front. Conchna and Aggro lifted their weapons and pointed them at the Sentinel. The Sentinel lifted his Calcar's arm, and the shield around Quinn and Miser dropped. The box flew by and shot through Conchna's hand and Aggro's rifle like a speeding bullet before landing in the holding slot in the Sentinel's palm. Conchna dropped his scythe in pain, and Aggro pulled his trigger, but the rifle was busted. The Sentinel approached the stunned Ray. His body shook and shivered. The Sentinel swiped his hand down, and the spikes retreated into the ground. He caught Ray before he could fall, and held his hand to the screen. The screen easily popped off, and the Sentinel was met with a smiling face. His face.
Boo!
It laughed. The laughing continued when the Sentinel fell, and the sky around him darkened with flowing blood. Quinn spiraled and spun until Ray stood in her place. Miser's head shook until Ray's screen sat comfortably on his neck. What's going on? The Sentinel stepped back, trying to get away.
You killed Matrona. You killed Matrona.
Ray's voice chanted.
You killed Amara. You killed her.
It chanted over itself.
You're a killer, just like him.
Stop! Stop it! The Sentinel closed his eyes before he shot up in a sweat on the ground. Ray stood over him. It was all a vision.
You can't even trust yourself, can you? What's real?
Ray smiled. Sentinel, what did he do? Quinn yelled from behind the shield. The Sentinel couldn't bring the words to his mouth. He thought for sure that everything he'd just done was real. Now he knew he couldn't do what he did in the vision because Ray was expecting it. Was everything happening now real? He would always be one step ahead. Just kill me already! The Sentinel yelled. Do it! End this! Ray stepped back and slowly clapped with his leather-gloved hands.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. That's what it takes to break a Sentinel.
Sentinel, come on, get up! Quinn yelled out for him desperately, but he continued to lay on the floor. Conchna pointed his scythe at the Sentinel, and Aggro raised his rifle nervously.
No.
Ray turned around.
Let him live.
Kill me! The Sentinel screamed desperately, crying and hyperventilating, searching for air. Quinn looked at Miser for help, mortified in her own right. She glanced around. Miser shook his head in disapproval, knowing she would try to save him. What do you mean? Vistor gave us specific orders to... Aggro tried to bargain with Ray.
I'm above you. I'm above Vistor.
Ray spoke softly. Says who? Conchna questioned. You're just a clone like us.
Says this.
Ray lifted his remote.
You've bestowed more power upon me than I think you wished.
He smiled grimly, and his eyes vibrated on the screen, empty.
Let's go.
Ray, Conchna, and Aggro made their way back to their ship. As they passed by the shield, Quinn began to walk forward aggressively. No! Miser held his hands out to stop her. No! Quinn pushed him away and ran after Ray. What have you done? Get back here, you coward! The Sentinel heard a gunshot, and he flinched. He closed his eyes, and a teardrop fell down his cheek. I'm sorry, he whispered to himself. He shook back and forth on the ground, sobbing. I'm so sorry.